Well, thank you so much for joining us today for our virtual discussion on fundraising East West trends, motivations, and practical insights from USA and Asia. And this really came partly from an online discussion, but also Peter and Heather, who joined me today, just having a conversation about global trends and philanthropists. So I'm delighted they can join us, and I'll introduce them in a second. But first of all three of us work for Philanthropy Company. So we're one of the more established UK consultancies, really with a genuine global footprint. Caroline Underwood founded the company around about 25 years ago, and we've worked right across the cultural landscape from education, including schools, universities, arts heritage, culture, health, international NGOs. Our team covers a complete spectrum of fundraising and leadership. That includes campaigns, endowment, coaching, interim, messaging, leadership, and much more. And what we really think sets us apart is that our people bring hands-on experience from major charities. We really work as an extension of your team, not just producing a report that sits on a shelf, but delivering practical work you can implement and support through your journey. So thank you again for joining us. So I'm Gordon Cox. I'm the director at the education function of a philanthropy company, and I advise universities, charities, founder-led organizations on international philanthropy, campaign strategy, and donor engagement. I've worked at 6 universities in the UK, and most recently I was the director at advancement of the University of Bath. Before that, I was the director of an Oxford college and worked for the University of Oxford itself. I personally describe myself now as a principal gift global fundraiser, traveled a lot, brought in gifts from Asia, Middle East, Europe, and Asia. And early in my career, I helped set up Edinburgh's North American office. And also my fundraising priorities at Oxford were the China Centre and modern languages. In advance of this, I calculated that about 80% of my 7, 8 figure gifts to the UK institutions were interestingly from international donors, and about 85% endowment. And beyond that, I'm a human geographer. I've traveled to 75 countries, and really the world is a hobby as much as my work. But this isn't really about me. I'm delighted to be joined by Heather Gellis-Ebner. So as a consultant at a philanthropy company, Heather brings extensive experience in US philanthropy, major gifts, and global donor engagement. She's known for a practical, relationship-centered approach and her ability to translate cultural nuance into actionable fundraising strategy. Heather has raised transformational gifts on 3 continents and spent 25 years learning what actually makes donors say yes. And that's why we're here today. Having led principal gift teams at UCL and the University of Oxford, and earlier in her career as a planned giving expert at Vassar College in New York, she's navigated the full complexity of cross-cultural fundraising. She's a dual British-American citizen. She understands the philanthropic instincts and expectations and etiquette of both worlds. And finally, we have Peter O'Connor. So Peter is a consultant at Philanthropy Company and a specialist in international fundraising strategy. He has worked with major institutions in international markets, building global profit pipelines and developing cultural tuned approaches to donor engagement. His recent work includes shaping international strategies for education, culture, and social impact organizations with a particular interest and focus on Asia. And most recently, Peter was Director of Development at Fitzwilliam College, Cambridge. And before that, he headed the Asia portfolio for Imperial at Imperial University. So thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Gordon.
So what are we here to talk about? Well, once again, fundraising East and West, trends, motivations, and practical insights from the US and Asia, very topical. So philanthropy, as we all know, is becoming much more global, but giving looks different from different regions. Recent data from CAF, CASE, and many other organizations show clear shifts in donor behavior in the USA and Asia. These regions continue to shape global giving and influence how fundraisers need to work. Understanding these differences is really essential if we want strong, long-term relationships with donors whose priorities may not match those in the UK. So this webinar is really for UK fundraisers, engaging supporters in the USA and Asia, and for colleagues from those regions who want to understand UK landscape. We'll look at cultural drivers, stewardship, expectations, regulations, and practical realities of building trust across borders. Whether you're new to international fundraising or refining your approach, this session will offer clear, experience-led insights to help you navigate global giving with confidence. So thank you. I'm going to move over to some questions now for Heather and Peter that hopefully will lead us in a direction of conversation. So I'm going to start with Heather. Heather, what are the biggest misconceptions UK fundraisers have about US donors?
A couple of things jump out, but I'd say one of the first ones is this idea that it's easier somehow because the Americans are more accustomed to this. I'd say it's different, but not necessarily easier. And there have been plenty of stories of donors who were waiting to be asked. And I think that their UK counterparts imagine somehow that they would just self solicit and volunteer what their gift might be. And that does happen from time to time. But I'd say the nuance of that is that what they really are expecting is directness. And I've had donors who were very uh, insulted somehow that their senior leader who came to visit them didn't ask. And they felt it was either unprofessional or that they weren't recognizing their role. So they definitely expect a degree of directness and probably faster than we might be accustomed to doing in the UK, but leaving it just to them to volunteer what level of support they might give is usually a mistake. I'd say the other big misconception I think is around motivations. And obviously, the three of us, gosh, we could talk all day long, right, about donor psychology, and all of them are very, very different. But I would say it is definitely my experience, certainly in higher education, this is true. They're not motivated by needs, they're definitely motivated by vision. So the way that we approach those conversations, I think, always needs to have a feeling of success that they can hitch a ride to. And sometimes I think that messaging has been like a little bit off, slightly tone deaf for that audience.
That's
Mm.
interesting. And I suppose we want to turn it around and ask a question about Asia. So, Peter, how would you describe the core cultural drivers of giving in Asia compared to the US?
Yeah, thank you. It's interesting. I think there's a lot of generalization about Asia as a market, quote unquote, um, because there's so many cultures within Asia. It's such a broad and vast region that I could talk about differences between different markets there all day. However, I think it's worth kind of trying to go back to that broader question, is thinking about um, the bigger sort of differences between the US and the markets within Asia. The US has got quite a sophisticated and quite well developed philanthropic culture of giving. It's very established. There are lots of mechanisms donors can use to give. There is a big expectation to donors to give. It's very well understood, and there are a lot of philanthropists who are used to making contributions and gifts philanthropically, including overseas. That's not necessarily always the case in Asia. Um, and I think that tends to kind of mean that philanthropy can be a little bit more personalized, a little bit less strategic in the way that people approach their decision making and think about their own motivations. I think some of the bigger or some of the broader cross-cultural trends across Asia in terms of those drivers to give can involve thinking about things like family and society. So how does an individual view themselves in the world? How do they then view their giving to charity? I mean, Heather, you just talked really wonderfully about vision rather than need. I think my experience talking to donors in different Asian contexts is that vision is important, but there is also an element of needs-based thinking, which is slightly more pronounced. But then also this view of what have their family given? What's the legacy? What have previous generations done? How can we build on that? How can we honour that? How does that affect broader society? And I think that maybe comes from the less individualistic worldview that many in Asian cultures have about themselves and their actions within the world. I think another big driver is thinking very much about cause. So education is tremendously important in many cultures in Asia. It's seen as a route to a better future. It's perhaps a slightly different way of thinking than perhaps it is in the West, where education might be more about giving back. There's a slight, I think, shift in terms of the wider cultural concept in which certain causes that we would think about in the West are perhaps translated through that worldview. I mean, you could talk as well about things such as aid or international development. That would want to be seen from an Asian perspective in terms of the asking the approach, and that's going to be the sort of the worldview and the driver the donor has, rather than perhaps a more Western-centric approach to that. And I think the third thing I'd say, which is quite an important driver in decision making, certainly, is the idea of Guanxi, or certainly in China and Chinese diasporas, which is this idea of trusted relationships, and that being a really key factor in terms of making gifts. If the donors you're speaking with know you, trust you, the same can be said with others in your institution, they feel connected to that, they are very likely to support and to help you and to want to do that, and for that to be a prerequisite of making a gift. Which is certainly a little bit different from the quicker, more direct ask you might see in the US that you just referenced, Heather. I think some of your top Asian prospects and donors, if the head of a university or a charity went and met them and they didn't know them very well, they'd be a bit surprised if they were asked there and then. They might expect another conversation to be had at a lower level between advisors. They would expect to kind of really get to know that individual and feel like they're a partner before wanting that ask to land with them, so that it's been sounded out in advance and that the context was fully understood. So a few thoughts from me. I could talk in more depth and in more specificity, but perhaps get into that later.
Thank you. So the next question I think is relevant no matter where you are in the world, and certainly as a Scotsman in England, it's very relevant to me. But a question for both of you, and I suppose I'll start with Heather. Are there particular philanthropic traditions or values in these regions that UK organisations often overlook? So first to you, Heather, then to Peter.
I'm not sure if it's still overlooked. I think people in the UK are increasingly aware of it, and I think it may even be changing here. But I would say a strong value in the US. I typically felt, and most of the donors I worked with there would say the same. Their education makes them. We don't have the same social class construct that you have in parts of the UK. And in the absence of that, it isn't only how much wealth and how successful a business is, but where you went to university. I can't overstate enough how much that's part of your identity. So, although from this side of the Atlantic, it often looks like loyalty to an institution, it is in part, but it's a little bit of self-identity. So it's really important. People will be very public about where they went to school, and they feel it's the making of them. And if not directly, then indirectly. So being seen to be a philanthropist at the place where you went to university also holds a certain cachet that sometimes I think isn't quite exactly the same here. And I think also there's a feeling that hospitals occupy, feels to me like a slightly elevated status. There's a value. More often, I encounter people who feel enormously grateful as patients and would volunteer quite readily to support hospitals and just feel this is the normal, natural course of things. Of course, you would support them. Your kid ends up with a broken leg and you've been in, and straight away you want to offer some funding to the hospital. I haven't quite encountered the same thing here. So there's some difference. There's obvious differences around religious traditions as well, but I think those are probably better known and more obvious to people in the UK.
And Peter, what would your thoughts be on that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I really like your point, Heather, about about the sort of the pride of institution people take in the US. I've always appreciated that difference. If you're ever looking at alumni gatherings between the UK and the US and how people dress, it's really popular to wear your university on your, on your hat, on your clothing. And in the UK, people would just they'd get a little bit embarrassed about that. It wouldn't be the same kind of identity-led sort of approach, at least not kind of publicly wandering around the streets. So you do sort of see that borne out in certain ways. I'd say certainly across Asia, there are some really interesting similarities there. I think healthcare is a really interesting one. You certainly see a lot of fundraising for hospitals and for community health in places like Hong Kong and Singapore and in China. But I would say kind of some of the interesting things I wanted to draw out probably relate to specific regions. So in a place like Hong Kong, there is quite a tradition of there's a tradition of family philanthropy. There's also a tradition of community serving on a board. Once you're on a board, you're expected to contribute and to support a cause, which is something also I think quite common to the US. But it's not something which is always a given in the UK, that you would join a leadership board and therefore be making your personal philanthropic commitments to things. But that doesn't necessarily translate to other regions across Asia. You might not see that, for example, in mainland China to the same degree. So that's an interesting thing which is worth thinking about. The other thing I wanted to say was community. I think people are often very rooted to place, whether that's where they live now, where they've come from, where their family have come from. And there is an emphasis about being seen to be supporting individuals within the community. And I think that's something which can sometimes be overlooked by UK institutions looking overseas, as the first thought is, what can you do for me? Not how do we position ourselves as a partner in your community, Or how are we helping members of your community who are perhaps studying in the UK or talking about the impact of our work across your community? So I think that's a really important thing as well about that visibility in that space. And I think there's certainly more that could be done there in thinking about how we position ourselves in that way, shape, or form.
Peter, if I could jump in on that, I would say that's spot on. And I think where I've been at places that were more successful in the Far East, it was where they did the extra legwork or homework in working out how support of a particular thing in the UK would have some direct benefit to the community that they're in. And if you couldn't find that or couldn't use that link, then maybe that was the wrong thing to be suggesting. So yeah, it's 100% a very clear difference, isn't it?
Mm.
I mean, I have a little observation from, I suppose, fundraising for a lot of languages in UK, and I wouldn't confuse language and culture or tradition. And an obvious, part of that is English as a language, which in a lot of these countries has become a business skill, a business tool. So don't be too worried about you not necessarily speaking the language of the region you're visiting. It is important to kind of acknowledge language in some way, but don't let that hold you back, because English is just a business skill now, and it's thankfully one that many of us have down to a fine line being English speaking in their base. So. Right, my next question is one for Peter. What early signals suggest an organization is ready to fundraise international?
Oh,
And you could
thanks,
talk about this
Gordon.
all day long.
Yes, I love this question. I'm going to try and keep this simple, and I'm going to try and boil this down to three things because I think it's good to have a clear guide. I think the first thing is your work as an organization. What is it you're doing that is important, the value of which can be stated in a compelling way across borders? If you are only working locally in the UK, then there's a good chance that it's going to be hard to attract international funding because you will say to yourself, well, what's the benefit or what is the interest in that funder? Unless you happen to find an international funder who is particularly interested about your community because they used to live there 30 years ago or they have particular vested interest, there isn't going to be much you can demonstrate to a funder which would claw their interest. So what is it you do well globally? Is it that you do groundbreaking research that is global in its impact and will help communities overseas? Is it that you increasingly recruit and teach students from international markets that go on and have a great impact back home? Or is it just as simple as the fact that your brand is so phenomenal and world leading that you can open doors internationally and it will attract attention and you will get people's attention and you've got things, a portfolio of things going on which you can demonstrate in that way. So I think that's it. And why do people overseas care and what is that piece? So I think being able to work that out and trying to put together something internationally which will attract potential interest and funding and being able to make that case really compelling and to think about how you would position that in the markets it would go to would be the next point. So that obviously brings us on naturally to markets. What is the community that you're going to go to fundraise from? What is the potential out there? You've got to understand your market based on what it is you're doing. So if you're doing a lot of groundbreaking work in public health that's going to help particular global communities, say in Southeast Asia, you've perhaps naturally got an interest in philanthropists who would have an interest in Southeast Asia or the work there to support you. So then being able to identify what is your market of potential funders there, what are your connections to them, how do you demonstrate that, is I think the next thing. There is another way to approach this, which is to look at your market first and think about the elements of your work which translate to those markets. So you could invert those 2 points. So you could, for example, say we've got thousands of people very well connected to us in the US. What in our work can we do, and can we demonstrate to that US audience that resonates? That's fine as well, but you've got to get that fit between them, that product market fit. Basically, your product is what it is that you're doing, your value proposition, and your market is those communities of international funders you wish to approach. Assuming you've identified one of those where there is a very good match and a fit, and you could say, yep, we could see 50 potential funders who could support us in a major capacity in these regions, and we can see as well that we've got something to bring to them which is really compelling and that we can engage them with. The last bit is putting together the strategy and the resource to map that. And I think if you can get to a point in your organization where you could say, we can see how this might work, we can see where our international market or markets are, and we can explore with leadership and also within our own internal staffing how we could cover this ground to facilitate relationships with funders that will enable us to build trust with them, gain support for projects, and ultimately put proposals to them and secure funding from them, then I think you've got those ingredients. In a small organization, that might be as simple as meeting with the head of the organization, saying, hey, I think we've got this great project. We've got 10 funders in this one particular geography who could support us. We should try and travel there and just get a little bit of commitment going and engagement going, so that we can build some relationships and put this to them. That might be as simple as your international piece, one single market, one single opportunity, and a willingness and a sensibility internally to understand that. Or it could be that you've got several markets and a large portfolio of donors and individuals, and you're able to basically increase what you're doing and to tackle markets you haven't worked in previously through that identification. I think the warning signs on this piece would be that you've got an appetite to do international fundraising, but don't have the first two things, your product or your market identified. And you can end up in a situation where people in the organization really want to work internationally to raise funds, but they're not thinking about what it is that they're actually going to be raising money for, and they haven't really thought about how they're going to resource and manage that. You've got to be able to show some sustained commitment in those markets you're working, to get to know your funders, to be able to solicit them for the support they're going to hopefully give you, then to receive the gift and be able to steward, thank, and fulfill that, so that you can go back to them and continue to build those relationships, and for that to become a long-standing stream of income that grows. One of the bigger dangers is to travel very frequently, very far and wide for other reasons, which the organisation might dictate, and to never really be covering your key philanthropic markets, or to be travelling without strategy, without purpose, engaging in what you can call development tourism, basically going around and saying hello to everyone, but never actually building those sustained relationships that lead to funding. So that would be my sort of piece, basically. Have your product, have your market, and be able to identify how your strategy and resource can be deployed effectively to realise the opportunities there.
Thanks, Peter. I mean, it's really great. I mean, I'm always struck by when people talk about international, and I say, do you know where your top 25 individual prospects are in the world? And they can't answer that question. And so much of a starting point is knowing where people are, and trying to avoid that, as you say, that development tourism, which I think doesn't set our sector in a great light when people come and go and don't really know why they're there. But that's a great guide, so thank you so much for that.
Yeah. Peter, it's such a great point about the sustainability, because I often think if you worked with fewer markets to start and had deeper engagement and relationships in that region, once you're off to the races, then you can add more. People rarely do it that way, but it's so much more successful to avoid this kind of scattershot approach where you just spread very thin and you don't engage in the way that you know you should be. So
yeah, I think that's really key, and it's something which I think all of us have seen probably over the course of our careers. We go into institutions who have done international work in various markets, and for whatever reason, they've fallen by the wayside, because resource shrunk, because people got more interested in another market or opportunity, and there just hasn't been that foundation which has been cared for and built upon. Instead, it's sort of, the foundation's been poured into the building, and then it's just been left unconstructed and started to crack and go a little bit wrong, and you come back and you think, oh goodness, what's happened here? And it's never been taken to where it should have been. So I think it's just vitally important to think about that, and to think that you've got to make a bit of a commitment to a region or a market once you've done all that hard work to get the proposition together and to have identified it.
definitely.
Well, thank you for that. I suppose, what messaging really resonates most strongly with donors in Asia and US, and why? I'm going to start with Heather for that question.
I think harkening back to something I said earlier, it's that kind of piece around motivation, vision versus need. I think the messaging that lands best and ideally with a US audience is one that's very visionary, very ambitious, feels like you're already a success, isn't really wrapped and enveloped in language that Americans might see as really negative. They can be accused, right? We can be accused of being overly optimistic and quite cheery, but given that that might be the case and might be a real cultural difference, if your language is quite heavy with, here's this problem, and obviously we need your help to solve it, versus here's how we're going to change the world, and they want to get on board with that. It's a slight difference, but it really is an important one. The other thing is around, I think the messaging, at least in the major gift space, it needs to feel, well, this is probably true even of lower level giving. What resonates best with an American audience is something that makes them feel it's slightly exclusive. You know, they as donors, they want to feel special. They operate as individuals, and so they don't really want to feel like they're just part of a collective. So I think that's even more the case in the US with the audience. So it's just how you make your approach feel that it's for them individually, and not just, hey, if we all do this together. I'm not saying that message never resonates, but it's usually less successful.
So often I'm characterized as a less cheery culture, but hopefully I buck that trend. Moving over to Peter to answer that question again. So.
This is interesting. I suppose, across different markets in Asia, there are slight nuances to this, but some kind of, I think, top takeaways. I think you probably find donors are less individualistic than perhaps they are in the US, as Heather's just shared. I've always found that being quite careful in terms of how you frame your messaging is the most important thing. You can sometimes put more urgent need, you can sometimes look at vision, but I think a really key thing is understanding how it is that you're honouring the person you're talking to, how it is you're positioning your message is really quite critical. So if you're able to obviously reflect the significance of this to your organisation, and how honoured you are to be working with a donor, if you're able to reflect that in a bigger context and to make them feel that they're doing something special and they're in the right company, which is quite common, I suppose, to that exclusivity you see in the US market, you put yourself in a very good position in terms of making that proposition. Very practically speaking, I've always found that if you are in an operation where you're using English as that de facto business language, as you were saying, Gordon, and you don't confuse language and culture. I try to keep my language quite straightforward in the messaging. Not necessarily more direct or indirect, but just keep it straightforward. Make sure it's easy and practical for the people you're engaging with to understand, especially if English isn't their first language. It's a good courtesy. And the final thing in that framing is looking and thinking about who the competitors are. And I think this is really good practice, really, in any donor relationship, but thinking about who else your donors and prospects are likely to be funding or have funded, and thinking about the types of conversations they might be having, the milieu in which they're in, and just making sure that you frame your ask within that sort of context. So if you're talking to a donor in Hong Kong about higher education, be thinking to yourself, what schools and universities are there locally, and also what's the international network of schools and universities that person might be interacting with, just so that you're able to position yourselves cleverly and in a way where the context in which that individual is working in, you're cutting through that and you're able to think about that in the message you're crafting.
Thank you. I think there's a lot to be said about simple language, no matter where you are in the world.
Yeah.
Certainly in fundraising. So my last question is back for you, Peter. How do stewardship expectations differ between US and Asian donors?
Thanks, Gordon. It's a really good question. And I've been thinking about this quite a bit, as there are definitely so many personal differences between people in terms of how you steward them. I think from my experience with Asian donors, there's a big expectation that stewardship is personal. People want to have built their relationships with the organization and they want to hear in a personal way, whether that's, mid-tier donors hearing from fundraisers who they've met very frequently in visits, and then wanting to be able to say hello when they're traveling to the UK with their families, wanting to be able to, really connect on a deep level and be able to speak to the people they're funding with, whether it's having, close conversations with the head of the institution. There is that value on the quality of the personal relationship that runs through stewardship like a thread. My experience naming is also a very important thing, and thinking about how that is reflected to a donor. And I've seen this go both ways. I've seen, for example, donors from mainland China who would like naming, but are very keen to keep a low profile because they think it might be sensible for them in terms of how they're perceived domestically. There are also donors who do not have that concern, who are very motivated by naming and ensuring that a name is prominently displayed and that they have that association with an institution with a global brand. So I think that's a really key thing to get right as well, and understanding your donor's position on that, what else they perhaps have named, how you're stewarding that, how you're presenting that is really key. I've often seen that tie in really nicely as well to things like family. So, donors thinking about their father, their grandfather, what are their links to other institutions, how is it they can reflect the contribution they've made to them in their lives. And I think that sort of commitment as well is really key. It extends to across, in university educational context, key members of faculty. If somebody has done a PhD with someone and that person has supervised them and made a transformative impact on their life and career, that can also factor into their decisions in naming. It's about that honouring of that which is bigger than oneself for some individuals. So those are a few things. Obviously, there's going to be the personal donor psychology that interacts with those themes and kind of cuts through to that. But I'd certainly say keep it personal, think about name, think about legacy, and frame that within the culture in which you're operating.
That's great. Well, thank you both so much, and thank you for joining us today. What we've touched on is really understanding regional giving cultures and also some practical fundraising approaches. This is actually a two-part discussion, so we're going to come back shortly and address building relationships across boundaries and borders, regulation, risk and practicalities, and future trends. So we hope you enjoyed the first session. I hope you can join us again to carry on the conversation. Thank you.